To draft the pattern for the front of the shirt, we're going to actually be using the back of the shirt as a template and guide. And this is because the boyfriend t-shirt, that front panel and bodice and the back panel and bodice is exactly the same silhouette in terms of width and shape along the torso and even into that arm. What you can't tell, but I can simply by touching this seam, is I know this seam for the shoulder and the sleeve is sitting right on top of the seam for it in the back. So knowing that, I can basically trace the back template to a certain degree. Couple things that do need to change. One, for the very front of the t-shirt, which is shorter than the inner layer and the back, this pattern for the front is going to be shorter than the back piece. And two, the boyfriend is a V-neck. So the neckband is up high in the back, but it's down low for the V, which means this part is going to end up being different. But everything else is going to be exactly the same. This might not be true of other shirts that you're making, and if it's not, then you can't use the back as a template. You simply just have to do exactly what we did for creating and drafting the pattern for the back piece as the front piece. But since in this case they are exactly the same, minus the length of the front nursing panel and the neckline, I'm just going to put my pattern weights down. I've already created that anchor, which is where my fold line is going to be. So we're going to put pattern weights down to prevent slipping and sliding, and we're going to get to work. So I've already pre-measured this, and I know that the difference in hem here is about 3 inches. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your ruler and you're going to eyeball 3 inches and make a couple of marks. There's one. There's 2. Along the side, there's a 3rd. And there's another. Now, I'm not worrying about seam allowances here because seam allowance has already been added to that back piece, which means by simply moving it 3 inches up higher, the seam allowance is already included for that front panel piece as well. So here I'm going to use my French curve to kind of help me. This is a pretty wide piece to be trying to connect the dots loose. So I'm going to try and get as accurate of a trace 3 inches higher as possible. And if you're off, it's not that big of a deal, honestly, because at the end of the day, it's your shirt and you're going to be wearing it. Now see, the dot that I created, my estimate of 3 inches is up here, but if you can see, the distance is pretty even, so I'm just going to keep going. And this is the beautiful thing about creating your own patterns, is you can adjust it and change it however you want. I could eliminate that high hip and just make it a straight t-shirt if I wanted, or I can make it longer, I can make it even shorter, I can do the nursing axis up high. So you can take your favorite piece and make the adjustments on it that you wish it had when you bought it from the store. So then the rest of this, for the side and the arm and the shoulder, I'm just going to trace using the back as the template. But I'm going to leave that V-neck alone. There. Okay, now when it comes to the V-neck, you're going to need to take your t-shirt and you're going to fold it in half, this time with the front of the fabric visible. Everything else you've traced, so really you're concerned about that V and where that point is, how far down that point is going to go. There. And again, you can change it. If you don't want a V, you can do a scoop neck. You just cut it, instead of taking it all the way down at an angle, you curve it in to make it a scoop. You can make that V but make it up higher so it's not going to show as much in the chest, or if you wanted, you can make it lower. All you need to do is make sure that your shoulder seam is lined up properly. Remember, we added that 1/4 inch seam allowance there. And with it lined up properly, this is how low the V-neck is going to come. See that? Sorry, there's a little bit of a shadow there. So I'm going to mark that point. And now I know that this edge of the shoulder, where that V-neck is going to start, needs to come down to meet this. Now, I don't want to make a straight line because the way that your body is shaped, and it's three-dimensional, there's curves. If you make it straight, it may lay a little funny, so you have to gently curve that using your French ruler. See how there's that little bit of a curve right here? To make it nice and pretty. And there you have it. And because this is our second piece, you're going to want to label it properly, just like we did with the back piece. So remove all of your pattern weights to give yourself space and label it. So we got to mark the fold. Now we need to do the nursing layer, the inner layer of the front. And again, we're not going to recreate the wheel. We're going to use what we have already created, which is a mash of template tracing the back as well as that front panel. Remember that the back of the t-shirt is the same hem length as the front, at least on the shirt that I'm using. If you are doing the Boyfriend 2.0 as it is, you may not be able to trace as much because that hemline looks different unless you want it to be longer in the front. But in my case, it is the exact same hem length in the front and in the back. And so I am going to trace the bottom portion of the Boyfriend 2.0 back for the front nursing layer. I have created my foundational fold line, so I'm just going to trace this bottom hem. Part of the thing about tracing is it allows you to pretty much ensure that your pieces are going to match properly. If you freehand traced every single piece, you may run into some components that aren't exact, which is fine. You can work your way around that, but it's not the ideal. The other part that you can trace is the shoulder. And now we need our front. There's a reason why we're not tracing the armhole, and I will get to that in a second. But we're going to move this. I guess because the front panel is shorter, I need to at least do some of this. And we'll line it up. I'm going to remove the back, and I'm going to bring that front panel that we traced already and drafted already and layer my nursing panel so that the parts that I've traced are lining up. So the hem is obviously different, but the little bit of the side here will line up, my fold line will line up, and that shoulder will line up. Okay. Now that I've anchored, I'm going to drop my pattern weights. And I'm going to trace that V-neck. Because I observed in the very first step that the two front layers are connected to each other and the V-neck band in the very front. So they have the same V-neck. All right, and then at this point, you are pretty much done being able to trace. And this is because when you look at the inside of the boyfriend, you'll notice this is that shoulder C, or this is where the sleeve attaches to the bodice and the shoulder. This is the side, and this, that's the raw edge has been enclosed in that binding. This is that nursing layer side. So it's not attached to the shoulder and it's not fully the length of the side. Instead, it's smaller. So here we're going to fold the t-shirt in half, making sure that the front is on the outside. So you're putting the back piece to itself, trying to match it the best that you can, knowing that gravity's not really helping you in this situation. You may have a little bit of trouble like I am right now, trying to get it to lay nicely. But again, this is not an exact science. We're kind of ballparking a lot of this. Lay the pattern weights down and get it to line up as best as you can. Okay, so we're really concerned about this inner piece right here. And to trace that, you're going to tuck in the sleeves and the back and the front so that the only thing that's exposed is that bound raw edge. You're going to do it with the bottom layer that's on the other half underneath, and it will create a bit of a bump, but that's okay because we're going to work with it. Okay. Now because this raw edge is encased in binding, there is no seam allowance. In other words, wherever you cut this side comes right up against to this binding. So you don't really need to account for any seam allowance here. If you do, it's really not too big of a deal. Looking at this, I can see that there's a 1/4 inch between where the binding ends and the seam is for the nursing panel. So using this, which is the seam marker armhole for the front panel, I'm going to bring it in about a 1/4 inch. Oops. There. Sliding around here. Connect it to the top. And before drawing all the way down, I'm going to mark where it connects to the seam in the side. So I know that when I go back, I can trace up to that point. And then I'm going to start dropping at slight angle to get rid of that extra seam allowance, the different points of where that raw edge would be. All right, so using this as my anchor, the fold as my anchor, I'm going to replace my pattern weights to try and keep things from sliding around. And I'm going to get my French curve ruler and connect those dots as nicely as I can. If you don't have a French ruler, that's fine. You can actually use a piece of cardboard. You just need to create a curve, like a candy cane shape, basically, and use that. The curves, the distance and the inches on the curves, I'm not using it at all. I'm just using the edge of it to help me. Others may look at that and go, really? She's not using those numbers? I am not, because I'm not that technical. But I've already tested the pattern, so I know it works. Okay, so remember, this is where it touches the side seam. I'm just gonna trace that and connect it to where it was. So now we have that nursing layer. I'm gonna mark the fold. This is another reason why I love the painting tarp. I can easily see through it and trace what I need to. Okay. Now the last part that I'm going to note pattern is this. I need to remind myself that this is a raw edge and not a part that needs to be folded over. So I'm just going to write binding. Bing! Binding, guys. Binding, not bing. Oops. Okay, so we now have completed 3 of the 5 pieces that we need. So we are going to move on to the hardest piece, which is the sleeve. And this is where you're going to need that piece of paper. And if you're not very good at math, you probably want a calculator as well.